December, something in the way the snow fell, almost too perfect, too still. Then, earlier that morning, he noticed for the first time what he later called the red frost. From the window of the tiny woodcraft shop he owned, Jonas had spotted the peculiar shimmer spreading across the windowsill. At first glance, it looked like a normal patch of frost except for a faint blush, as though someone had streaked red dye along the edges of each spiky crystal. His breath caught. He placed a hand on the glass, and cold radiated through his glove so sharply that it burned. Whatever this frost was, it felt alive. Silvervale had seemed like the perfect place to start over when he lost his wife, Emily, a few years ago. He'd needed somewhere quiet, somewhere far from the busyness of city streets and constant reminders of his old life. His 8-year-old daughter, Olivia, was equally enthralled by the quaint mountain town. Cozy cabins, majestic evergreens, and gentle snowfall that started in November and lasted all the way through Christmas. But this December hadn't felt gentle at all. Peeking behind him, Jonas saw Olivia engrossed in her coloring book by the stove. She wore 2 sweaters, a little hat, and gloves with the fingertips cut off so she could still hold her crayons. The old wood-burning stove rattled and coughed as it fought to keep the shop warm. Fuel had been dwindling in Silvervale, courtesy of the unrelenting weather. Day after day, storm clouds strangled the sun, leaving the town in a perpetual gloom. "You okay, kiddo?" Jonas asked softly, trying to keep the quiver out of his voice. Olivia looked up, her big brown eyes shining with a childlike trust. "I'm good, Dad," she said. "Just wish it would snow normal again. It's too cold to go out and build a snowman." Jonas forced a smile. "Maybe soon," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The bell above the shop door jangled, cutting through the silence. Mayor Caldwell stepped in, his tall frame dwarfed by layers of thick winter gear. His face was set in a grim expression, and for a moment he said nothing, simply rubbing his gloved hands. Jonas recognized the mayor's mood. Bad news had a way of traveling quickly in a small town. "Jonas," Mayor Caldwell said in a low tone. "We need your help. We're organizing a search team." Jonas frowned. "What happened?" Caldwell let out a long breath, forming a plume of steam in the frigid air. "2 of our residents have gone missing. Their families say they disappeared overnight." A chill unrelated to the temperature slid through Jonas's bones. "Any sign of foul play?" The mayor shook his head. "No signs of anything. Just footprints ending in a patch of some sort of red ice. After that, nothing. It's like they vanished." Jonas exchanged a glance with Olivia, who looked worried now. "I'll join you," he said. "Just let me lock up. Where do we start?" Within the hour, Jonas found himself trekking through knee-deep snow with a handful of volunteers, weaving between evergreens that whispered ominously in the wind. The red frost seemed to cling to every surface: tree trunks, rocks, the edges of old wooden fences. Beneath each volunteer's boots it crackled and splintered with an almost metallic resonance. Though Jonas had grown up in snowy winters, he'd never felt snow so deathly cold that it stung like static electricity. Dr. Rivera, a traveling scientist stranded in Silvervale by the storms, joined the search. She had insisted on coming, explaining she might recognize any atypical phenomena. Jonas was grateful for her expertise, though he doubted she'd ever studied something like this under normal circumstances. While the search team spread out, Jonas and Dr. Rivera moved along an old logging trail behind the cabins on the outskirts of town. When Jonas knelt to brush powdery snow aside, he spotted clear, sharp footprints leading out of one of the missing residents' backyards. Then the footprints just stopped. Dr. Rivera crouched next to him. "Remarkable," she whispered. Her breath shook with adrenaline and fear. "Look at this!" She chipped away a piece of the frost, revealing deep red crystals that glittered like garnets. A sharp hiss escaped, as if the frost itself took offense at being disturbed. "How is it so red?" Jonas asked, unable to hide his unease. "I'm not sure, but I can feel it pulling heat from my glove, almost like it's feeding." She swallowed hard. "I've never seen anything like this." Jonas felt an instinctive dread coil in his stomach. "If it's feeding on heat, does that mean it's alive?" Dr. Rivera didn't answer. She kept carefully slipping the sample into a small vial, her expression grim. Then, as if nature wanted to confirm their fears, a cold wind howled through the trees, and Jonas swore he heard a faint whisper woven into the gusts. It sounded like someone calling his name. He jerked around, heart pounding. Nothing was there. just red-tinted skeletal branches swaying in the wind. They continued searching until dusk, but no luck. It was as though the missing neighbors had vanished into thin air, stolen away by the silent, pulsing frost. Despite the cold seeping into his bones, Jonas's Mainka, he needed to get back to her. The sun would set soon, and he didn't want his daughter alone in an unheated shop during this unsettling phenomenon. When Jonas returned to the shop, Olivia was sleeping near the stove. He stoked the fire and carefully draped a blanket over her small body. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but he couldn't shake the dread that had settled in his mind. Something was very wrong with Silvervale this Christmas, and he had a feeling the red frost was only getting started. Jonas reached out to touch the shop window, hoping to brush away the crimson streaks. The glass was so cold that he recoiled in pain. In the weak glow of the lantern, the frost seemed to shift under his gaze, as if aware of his presence. He saw the reflection of his own wide, frightened eyes, and behind him, Olivia's slumbering form. A rush of protectiveness surged through him. He'd do anything to keep her safe. Then he noticed the radio on the counter flicker with static. Briefly, he heard Mayor Caldwell's voice. All units, multiple sightings, red frost spreading, maintain indoors at night, vanishings, use caution. The signal cut in and out before going silent. Jonas's dread deepened. They weren't just dealing with bad weather. This was a menace, claiming victims under cover of darkness. He locked the door and checked the fire once more before settling beside Olivia. As the last traces of twilight faded outside, an uncanny silence filled the world. Jonas realized with a shiver that even the wind had died, as if the winter night held its breath in anticipation. In that hush, the red frost covering the window began to faintly glow. Jonas closed his eyes, clinging to Olivia's warmth and the soft crackle of burning wood. He prayed for morning to come quickly, desperate for answers and safety. Yet even in his drifting thoughts, he felt an unsettling certainty. The frost would come for them all if they didn't stop it. Morning arrived without any fanfare. The sun, pale and distant behind ashen clouds, offered no warmth to the beleaguered town of Silvervale. Jonas woke to a dull ache in his joints and found Olivia curled against him, still asleep by the stove. It took him a moment to remember why he was sleeping on the floor of his own shop. Then he spotted the red frost on the windows, jagged and menacing in the gray light. Memory returned like a cold slap to the face. He sat up and carefully shook Olivia awake. They both shared a simple breakfast of stale bread and lukewarm water. Supplies were running dangerously low all over town. The local grocery had been picked clean in anticipation of the storms, and deliveries wouldn't arrive until the mountain roads cleared. Silvervale felt more isolated than ever. "I'm going to head over to town hall," Jonas said, rubbing the dark circles under his eyes. "Stay here and keep the fire going, okay?" Olivia gave him a reluctant nod. Despite her youth, she was old enough to sense something big and frightening was happening. "Be careful, Dad," she whispered. Town hall was only a few blocks away, but walking felt like trudging across a frozen tundra. The red frost glistened on fences, rooftops, and pine needles. Occasionally, Jonas noticed bright red crystals jutting out like dagger-sharp spikes on car hoods. It was as though the frost was growing bolder, claiming anything warm enough to sustain it. When he reached the old brick building, he saw a group of anxious townspeople gathered in the foyer, trying to warm themselves near a single propane heater. Mayor Caldwell stood at a lectern, flipping through notes while Dr. Rivera addressed the crowd. "The sample I collected shows an alarming heat absorption rate," she explained, holding up a small glass vial filled with red ice crystals that sparkled like broken rubies. "It's pulling thermal energy from everything around it, living or not. The more heat it gathers, the faster it spreads." A somber murmur filled the room. One elderly man coughed violently in the cold air, his breath escaping in short bursts of vapor. Jonas frowned, feeling a pang of fear twist in his chest. If the frost was alive and feeding, then how could they possibly stop it? Mayor Caldwell motioned Jonas over. "We're updating everyone on the situation," he said, his voice low. "We've had 3 more disappearances overnight." Jonas's eyes widened. 3 more? Who?" "Kara Bishop, Dave Fielder, and young Tommy Granger." His mother's beside herself. The mayor shook his head, frustration evident in every tense line of his face. They were at home, locked doors and all. In the morning, gone. Just a trail of footprints leading outside to a big patch of that damned frost. Jonas pictured Olivia alone at his shop and swallowed hard, resisting the urge to sprint back. "This can't keep happening," he said. We have to do something. Dr. Rivera cleared her throat, sensing the conversation. I've been running calculations. We need to limit exposure to the cold as much as possible. That means rationing heat sources and consolidating people in fewer buildings. Strengthen numbers. If we all band together in, say, town hall or the church, we can try to maintain a higher temperature. Won't that just make a bigger target for the frost? Jonas asked, voicing the thought that gnawed at him. Potentially, Dr. Rivera admitted. But separated, we're vulnerable. We need to think of immediate survival while we search for a permanent solution. Mayor Caldwell motioned for everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, for now, we'll have to stay together at Town Hall. Bring your families, essential supplies, and anything we can burn for warmth. Lock up your houses, but don't linger. We'll form teams to help those who need assistance. The plan was met with a hesitant, murmuring agreement. Everyone knew it was risky, but so was staying put in smaller, scattered homes that might as well have been targets for the mysterious frost. Jonas stepped aside, quickly calling his shop's landline to check on Olivia. No answer. He tried again, still no answer. Anxiety gnawed at his stomach. The line must have been down. He'd have to hurry back and get her. He sprinted through the brittle air, ignoring the way his lungs burned with each ragged breath. The sky hung heavy with the promise of another snowstorm, and Jonas sensed the temperature dropping even further. Had it always been so cold, or was the frost somehow sapping what little warmth remained in the atmosphere? When Jonas burst into the shop, he found Olivia still by the stove. Relief flooded him. She looked up, startled by his abrupt entrance. "Dad?" she asked, voice trembling. "The phone rang and then cut off. I got scared." "It's okay, we're both okay," Jonas said, swallowing the panic in his throat. "Listen, we have to move. We're gathering at Town Hall. It's safer there, or at least that's the plan. Pack whatever you can quickly. We won't be back here for a while." Olivia nodded, hurriedly stuffing her small backpack with a change of clothes, a cherished stuffed animal, and some of her crayons. Jonas grabbed extra blankets, cans of food, and a few personal items, photographs of Emily mostly. He couldn't leave those behind. Outside, the wind had started again, swirling around them in icy gusts. Patches of the red frost glittered ominously in the daylight, each crystal reflecting the grim, pale sky. They managed to reach Town Hall with minimal trouble, though Olivia gasped when her foot grazed a crimson-coated curb. Feeling the frost instantly leach warmth from her boot, she pulled away, shivering, and kept close to her father. By midday, more townspeople arrived at Town Hall in a staggered stream, each group bringing whatever supplies they had. Canned goods, flashlights, propane tanks, old quilts, even battered wooden furniture to burn if necessary. Dr. Rivera coordinated a makeshift lab in one corner, placing her red ice samples on a metal tray and noting every minor change. The scene resembled a wartime shelter. Frightened faces, huddled families, the smell of desperation. Still, Jonas's heart lifted a bit seeing neighbors helping one another. In times of crisis, Silvervale was the kind of town that pulled together. He just hoped it would be enough. Around nightfall, the sense of foreboding returned tenfold. Jonas sat next to Olivia and listened to the howling wind outside. The building was mostly dark. They had limited fuel for the generator, so lights were used sparingly. Mayor Caldwell lit a lantern, illuminating the anxious faces gathered in the main hall. A hush fell over everyone as if waiting for an announcement, or perhaps for something terrible to happen. Suddenly, the wind died in an instant. An eerie silence that left ears ringing. Jonas felt a drop in temperature so profound it nearly stole his breath. The windows of Town Hall glazed over with a fresh layer of the red frost, crackling across the glass like branching veins. Dr. Rivera jumped to her feet, muttering hurried observations into her notepad. Others clung to each other, terrified. That's when the scratching started. Faint at first, barely audible. Then a chorus of sharp scraping noises on every window and door, as if dozens of nails raked the exterior. Olivia clutched Jonas's arm, her eyes wide with dread. A wave of panic rippled through the gathered crowd. Jonas's heart pounded as he stood, scanning the windows. He caught a glimpse of something moving against the crimson frost, an elongated shape that seemed half-fused with the ice itself. A figure, or maybe multiple figures, writhing just beyond the glass. It was impossible to see any detail, but Jonas sensed they were looking in, searching for warmth, for life. His skin crawled. At that moment, a deafening crack echoed from the roof, followed by the distant, chilling sound of glass shattering somewhere down the hallway. Silvervale's fragile refuge was under siege by a horror they scarcely understood. Jonas held Olivia close, determination flaring in his chest. They would survive this. He had to believe that. And yet, as a collective scream rang out from behind the town hall offices, Jonas couldn't help but feel this was only the beginning of the Red Frost's true power, its unstoppable hunger for human warmth and life itself. Glass shards tinkled across the linoleum floor of the town hall corridor, each chime echoing like the last notes of a sinister lullaby. Jonas's mind raced as the crowd pressed inward, panic suffocating the main hall. Olivia clung to his arm, trembling. It was like being trapped inside a giant snow globe, except the swirling flakes outside were a lethal crimson frost. A terrified scream erupted nearby. Several townspeople sprinted toward the source of the noise, a shattered window in a side room where the red frost had forced its way in. Jonas could just make out that same writhing shape near the broken pane, half-living ice with elongated limbs that seemed to melt and reform at will. The shards of frost, crimson, crystalline, spilled onto the floor, radiating cold so intense it burned. A jolt of horror cut through Jonas. The frost wasn't just passively absorbing heat, it was actively hunting. "Everyone back!" Dr. Rivera shouted. She snatched a fire extinguisher from the wall, aiming a spray of carbon dioxide at the swirling red mass. A crackling hiss split the air, and the frost shrank back momentarily, leaving behind a smear of translucent red that continued to pulse with an alien glow. "That did something," Jonas muttered, eyeing the frost's reaction. "At least it slowed it down." Dr. Rivera nodded, breath ragged. "Carbon dioxide is extremely cold when discharged. It's possible it disrupted the frost's structure, but it'll only last for so long." Mayor called, pale-faced, took stock of the chaotic scene. "Dr. Rivera, do you have any other tools we can use?" She lifted a trembling hand to her forehead. "I've been analyzing the sample. The crystals absorb thermal energy at an incredible rate, almost like a reverse catalyst that keeps feeding on itself. If we manage to break that chain reaction, even briefly, we might stop it. But we'd need something powerful." A hush settled over the hall, broken only by the whimpering of frightened children and the distant scratching of more frost limbs against the walls. Jonas looked down at Olivia, recalling how the flames in his wood stove kept the frost at bay for a little while. Fire was warmth, though, and that was exactly what the frost craved. It was a risk, but maybe Dr. Rivera had a plan. "Mayor, Dr. Rivera," Jonas said. "Is there any place in Silvervale with a big enough heat source? Something we could use to lure the frost away from everyone else?" Caldwell frowned. "There's the old factory's boiler system on the north side of town, but it hasn't run in years." Dr. Rivera's eyes lit with sudden inspiration. "If we could get it working, if we feed the frost too much heat all at once, maybe we can force a meltdown in its structure. The same principle as short-circuiting a circuit board with an overload." An insane idea, but desperation fueled them. Jonas scanned the hall, noticing more swirling shapes pressing against the tinted windows, red crystals spiderwebbing across the glass. They had to do something before everyone froze to death or vanished into those horrifying patches of crimson. "All right," Jonas said, taking a steadying breath. "I'll go. Mayor, can you rally a few volunteers to keep this place secure? Dr. Rivera, you come with me. We'll see if the old boiler can be fired up." Mayor Caldwell clapped him on the shoulder, forcing a weak grin. "Be careful, Jonas, and bring back good news." They set out under the cover of swirling snow, navigating streets turned into a labyrinth of razor-sharp red frost. Jonas, Dr. Rivera, and two other townspeople, Derek and Beth, carried flashlights and wore multiple layers of clothing. Each exhalation seemed to freeze mid-air. The frost crunched beneath their boots, almost screaming for warmth. "Straight ahead," Derek called, pointing through a swirl of white and crimson drifts. The outline of the old factory loomed like a slumbering beast against the storm-dark sky. Jonas's heart thumped as they pushed open the rusted double doors and entered the cavernous interior. Rusted machinery, collapsed catwalks, and ancient boilers greeted them with ghostly silence. Their flashlight beams revealed swirling motes of dust, swirling as if alive in the frosty air. "Down there," Beth said, gesturing to a huge metal tank surrounded by twisted pipes, likely the old boiler. Dr. Rivera dashed forward, her breath ragged with cold. She knelt by the control panel, wiping away decades of grime and tapping the gauges. Let's see if we still have any power, she murmured, prying open a control box. With a spark of luck, or possibly fate, there was a flicker from a half-dead battery circuit. If we can transfer enough energy to spark the ignition and feed the boiler, we might get a single burst of intense heat. That might be all we need. They poured what little diesel they had left into the main line, hooking up a portable generator. The place smelled of rancid fuel and rust. A hush fell as Dr. Rivera tested the ignition switch. Click. Nothing. Click. Another pause. Then vroom! The ancient boiler rumbled awake like a dragon stirring from centuries of slumber. Jonas, Derek, and Beth let out near-simultaneous cries of relief, though they knew it was far from over. If this worked, the boiler would become a beacon for the frost, an offering of pure heat. The temperature in the factory began to rise, steam whistling from the worn pipes. Jonas could feel the hairs on the back of his neck prickle. They didn't have to wait long. A thunderous crash came from the front doors. The red frost surged inward, a swirling cloud of shimmering crystals that advanced with unnerving intent. Derek cried out, stumbling backward as the frost inched toward him, twisting into spectral shapes. "They're alive," he whispered, voice trembling. "No time!" Dr. Rivera yelled. "Jonas, open every release valve on the boiler. We need full heat output now." Jonas rushed around the massive metal tank, twisting valves as steam blasted forth in scalding jets. The temperature shot up drastically, turning the interior of the factory into a sweltering chamber. Sweat beaded on Jonas's forehead, which felt surreal in the middle of a lethal winter. The frost hissed and recoiled at first, then advanced anew, drawn by the staggering amount of heat. Tendrils of living ice slithered across the concrete floor, forming gnarled limbs that reached for the boiler. Each time the frost gained ground, Jonas and the others retreated further back, letting it converge on the industrial behemoth at the heart of the room. Just then, Dr. Rivera pulled out a small container of chemicals, her last-ditch plan. "I tested a reaction," she shouted to Jonas. "If we superheat this mixture and combine it with the steam, it should cause a thermal cascade." "Do it!" Jonas yelled. Dr. Rivera flung the container into the heart of the boiler's flame. The reaction was immediate and explosive, a deafening roar as metal groaned. Heat radiated out in a shockwave. 1,000 stinging sparks soared through the air like molten fireflies. Jonas, Dr. Rivera, Derek, and Beth dove for cover behind a metal pillar. A scream, like ice scraping glass, tore through the factory as the frost shapes convulsed. The intense heat of the overloaded boiler assaulted them, their crystalline limbs fracturing. Crimson shards rained down, melting into puddles of water that steamed on the scorched floor. Jonas winced, covering Olivia's photograph in his pocket to shield it from flying debris. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The roar of the boiler ebbed into a fading rumble. Where the frost had been, only dripping water remained, stained faintly pink like diluted blood. Derek slumped to his knees, stunned. Beth let out a shaky laugh of disbelief. Dr. Rivera smiled through tears, her voice unsteady. "It worked! Oh, thank God it worked!" Jonas forced himself to his feet, scanning the factory. No sign of the lethal frost remained, only scorched walls and the pungent smell of burnt metal. "We have to get back to town hall," he said. "Make sure everyone else is all right." They emerged from the factory into an eerily still night. Snow was still falling, but the menacing red crystals had vanished, leaving only normal white snow underfoot. Relief battled exhaustion in Jonas's heart. If the frost was truly gone, maybe Silvervale had a chance to celebrate Christmas after all. When they returned to town hall, the townspeople greeted them with hesitant hope. Mayor Caldwell let out a tearful shout at the sight of the safe party. Jonas scooped Olivia into his arms, tears in his eyes. She sobbed softly, clinging to him. Dr. Rivera announced that the threat appeared to be destroyed. Cheers mingled with disbelieving laughter. Outside, dawn began to lighten the sky, a new day. Though the memory of the red frost would scar Silvervale for generations, there was a palpable sense of rebirth in the crisp morning air. Jonas looked into Olivia's eyes, remembering Emily and everything they'd been through. He clutched the photograph in his coat pocket, heart pounding with gratitude. "We made it," he whispered, pressing his forehead to his daughter's. A warmth bloomed in his chest, not just relief, but the promise of a future no longer overshadowed by a creeping terror. That Christmas morning, all odds, Silvervale stood united. And while the townspeople would never forget the nightmare of the red frost, they reveled in the simplest of gifts, the return of ordinary, untainted snow. For Jonas and Olivia. If you like our short stories, please like, comment, and subscribe. Jonas Gray pulled his wool collar tight against the icy wind that whistled through the towering pines. A bitter chill clung to the mountain air, far colder than any winter he'd endured since moving to Silvervale. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about this December, something in the way the snow fell, almost too still. Then, earlier that morning, for the first time what he later called the rust. From the window of the tiny woodcraft shop he owned, Jonas spotted the peculiar shimmer spreading across.
If you like our stories, please like, comment, and subscribe. The Art of Deception. Detective Naomi Ray halted at the entrance to Luca Vermeulen's studio, feeling the weight of the scene before her. The studio had an almost haunted aura, filled with relics of a life built on art and meticulous control, a legacy both dazzling and grotesque. A faint chemical odor clung to the air, a mixture of paint, solvents, and something metallic, a scent that whispered secrets to those daring enough to listen. The flickering fluorescent lights overhead cast an eerie glow, illuminating fragments of Luca's world. Scattered palettes, worn paintbrushes, sketches pinned haphazardly on the walls, each artifact suspended in a stillness that felt alive. As Naomi's eyes scanned the space, she caught sight of Luca's latest creation, his final creation, the Fall of Saints. The mural stretched across an entire wall, a sprawling canvas of terror and beauty, both incomplete and perfect. Naomi felt an uneasy pull toward it, as though the faces within it were pleading for her to understand them. Luca's signature technique, a breathtaking manipulation of light and shadow, rendered each figure disturbingly lifelike. The faces seemed to pulsate with unspoken emotion, each a silent scream frozen in time. In the center was the face of Simon Gauthier, Luca's apprentice. Naomi recognized Simon immediately, even through the artistic embellishments. The young man's wide eyes and open mouth were painted with such precision that she could almost hear his silent scream. Around Simon's neck was his signature red scarf, yet in Luca's hands, it had transformed into something sinister, curling tightly like a noose ready to choke the life from him. Beside him was Mara Lang, Luca's ex-wife and former muse. Mara's face, known to the world through countless portraits, was twisted in a mixture of rage and sorrow. Luca had captured her essence with such intensity that Naomi felt a pang of empathy for the woman she'd never met. Luca had been Mara's partner, her lover, her obsession, and ultimately her undoing. But here, in his final work, he had reduced her to a mere fragment of his twisted vision, her beauty shadowed by despair. Toward the edge of the mural, nearly swallowed by darkness, was Oscar Finch, Luca's longtime art dealer and confidant. In life, Oscar was known for his charm, his magnetic presence, the way he could effortlessly draw people into Luca's world. Yet here, Luca had painted him as a man recoiling from some unseen horror, his expression a mixture of fear and disgust, his usually vibrant face blending into the shadows as though he were already fading from existence. Naomi couldn't help but shiver. This mural wasn't just art. It was a confession, a twisted love letter, a chilling premonition all in one. Luca had poured his soul into this final piece, and it seemed to watch her, whispering the secrets he had taken to his grave. "Detective Ray?" Officer Grant's voice broke the heavy silence. She turned to see him standing a few feet away, a grim look on his face. "The frame finished up last night," he said, handing her a folder of reports. "They're ruling an accident, a fall from the scaffolding while he was working. No signs of foul play." Naomi nodded, though her gaze remained fixed on the mural. "Did they find anything unusual?" Grant hesitated, his eyes drifting to the mural before he answered. "Nothing definitive, but something doesn't sit right. Luca was a perfectionist, known for his control. Falling like that, it seems strange." Naomi's eyes narrowed as she took in the scene once more. Luca had been meticulous, obsessively controlling in every aspect of his work and life. A man like that wouldn't make a careless mistake, especially not on his magnum opus. Her eyes caught a small detail in the upper corner of the mural, a faint hourglass symbol, nearly obscured by swirling colors, its sands almost completely drained. An hourglass, the universal symbol of time slipping away. This wasn't just a work of art, it was a message. Naomi felt it in her bones. "Grant, I need every file we can get on Simon, Mara, and Oscar. Their history with Luca, any conflicts, any unresolved issues. And check for any unusual incidents or unexplained deaths connected to Luca. This mural is speaking to us. We just need to listen." Grant's expression shifted, but he nodded. "I'll gather everything we have." As he left, Naomi returned to studying the mural, every face and brushstroke a silent plea for understanding. If her instincts were correct, Luca's death was no accident. This mural was the heart of a labyrinth, one that held dark secrets waiting to be unraveled. Back at her desk, Naomi sifted through piles of files, each one a fragment of Luca's world. The more she uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. Luca's life was a web of connections, each thread tied to someone he had drawn close, only to sever when they no longer suited him. Each person had been pulled into his orbit, only to be left scarred, discarded, or, in some cases, erased. Her investigation led her first to the case of Ella Torres, a young artist who had idolized Luca early in her career. He had taken her under his wing, mentoring her, sharing his philosophies and techniques. She saw him as her hero, a guiding star in the often ruthless art world. But their relationship had soured after a public altercation. Witnesses described it as heated, with Luca's voice rising to a level that was, even for him, terrifyingly intense. Within a week, Ella had vanished. Her body was discovered days later in a nearby lake, her death ruled as accidental drowning. Yet her family insisted there was more to the story, that Ella had been deeply disturbed in the days before her disappearance. Naomi noted the unresolved tension in the case notes, an echo of doubt that had lingered ever since. Next was Julian Klein, a sculptor whose star had once shone as brightly as Luca's. The two artists had been contemporaries, their careers intertwined in mutual admiration and rivalry. Julian had publicly criticized Luca's work, dismissing it as empty, pretentious, devoid of real emotion. The words had cut deeply, and Luca had never forgiven him. Following Julian's critique, his reputation began to crumble, whispers of scandal and disgrace haunting him until his final days. Less than a year after his public denouncement of Luca, Julian fell from the balcony of his studio. His death ruled a suicide. But those who knew Julian described him as thoughtful, meticulous, not the type to act on impulse. The case notes hinted at an unresolved tension, a question mark that had haunted the investigators. The case. Then there was Anton Green, a prominent gallery owner and once Luca's closest confidant. Anton's gallery had showcased Luca's most famous works, and the two had been inseparable for years. But something had soured between them in the months leading up to Anton's death. He had distanced himself, refusing to host Luca's latest exhibits, turning down commissions he once would have accepted without a second thought. Anton was found dead of an opioid overdose, a surprise to those who knew him as strict about his health and lifestyle. The death was ruled accidental, and the case was closed without further investigation. Naomi frowned as she took in the details of each file. Ella, Julian, Anton, all had been close to Luca, each discarded in the wake of a bitter conflict or estrangement. Their lives had ended tragically, suspiciously, and without resolution. The mural seemed to speak of them too, faces echoing fear, despair, and betrayal. It was as though Luca's hand had guided each tragedy, erasing those he no longer wanted in his world. But what of those still in his orbit? Naomi knew she needed to talk to Simon, Mara, and Oscar. She arranged interviews, hoping to find answers where there had only been questions. Naomi sat in the sterile confines of the precinct's interview room, waiting as Simon Gauthier entered. He looked smaller than she remembered, his usually sharp demeanor dulled, his posture hunched with exhaustion. As he took a seat across from her, Naomi could see the tension in his eyes, a mixture of fear and anger. "Thank you for coming, Simon," she began, her voice calm and measured. "I want you to feel comfortable here. This isn't an interrogation. It's a conversation. I need you to be honest with me so I can understand what happened." Simon glanced down, his hands fidgeting. "I don't know what you want me to say," he murmured. "Luca and we had disagreements, sure. But I would never—" His voice trailed off, his gaze fixed on the floor. Naomi watched him carefully. "Simon, I know about the pressure Luca put on you. I know how demanding he was, how he pushed you. But sometimes, admiration can turn into something darker. Did Luca ever make you feel threatened?" Simon's shoulders slumped, and for a moment Naomi saw something flicker in his eyes. Fear, anger, and something else. An emotion he seemed almost too ashamed to acknowledge. He had this way of looking at people, like he could see every flaw, every imperfection. He made you feel small, like you were nothing if you didn't live up to his expectations. I thought he was pushing me to be better, but after a while, I realized he wasn't helping me. He was controlling me. Naomi let Simon's words settle, each one revealing a layer of his relationship with Luca. "Did you ever feel that he might hurt you?" Simon hesitated, his hands clenching into fists. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Yes. There were times when I thought he would find a way to destroy me. It was like living in a nightmare, every day wondering if it would be my last." Naomi arranged to meet with Mara Lang, Luca's former muse and ex-wife. Mara entered the interview room with a guarded expression, her gaze steady as she took a seat across from Naomi. Unlike Simon, whose fear was barely contained, Mara's face was unreadable, a mask of controlled composure. But Naomi could see the strain beneath it, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes hinting at a tension that had been simmering for years. "Thank you for coming, Mara," Naomi said, keeping her voice respectful. "I know discussing Luca may bring up difficult memories, but your insights could help me understand what truly happened." Mara's lips curved into a humorless smile. "Detective, there's no need to tiptoe around this. I've been dealing with the consequences of knowing Luca Vermeulen for a long time. This is just the final chapter." Naomi nodded, leaning forward. "You were once very close to Luca. His muse, his inspiration, perhaps even his obsession. But I also know that he took more from you than he ever gave." Mara's eyes flashed with anger, a spark of raw emotion quickly extinguished. "Obsession doesn't begin to describe it. Luca was consumed by his own vision, and he saw me as an extension of that. To him, I was more than a muse. I was a possession, a part of his pure world. Every part of me had to fit his ideal, or I was nothing." Naomi's gaze was steady. "Did you ever feel like your life was in danger? That he might remove you if you failed to meet his standards?" Mara hesitated, the mask slipping for a brief moment. "There were moments when I feared for my life, Detective. He was never violent, not in a physical sense. But he had a way of breaking you down, of making you feel like you were worthless if you didn't fit into his perfect world. I realized too late that Luca didn't see people as individuals. He saw us as pieces of his masterpiece, tools he could manipulate and discard." Naomi absorbed Mara's words, each one a testament to the toxic power Luca had wielded over those closest to him. "Mara, what finally made you leave him?" Mara's expression darkened, her gaze distant as though she were reliving painful memories. "I finally saw him for what he was. A man who didn't love, who didn't care. He was a black hole, pulling everyone into his orbit until there was nothing left of them. I couldn't bear to be consumed by him any longer." There was a bitter edge to Mara's voice, a lingering sense of betrayal that went beyond mere disappointment. Naomi sensed that this was a woman who had lost herself in Luca's world, only to claw her way out, leaving fragments of her soul behind. "Thank you, Mara," Naomi said softly. "I know this wasn't easy, but you've given me invaluable insight into Luca's psyche." Mara nodded, her face unreadable once more. "I just hope it helps you understand what he truly was. People called him a genius, but he was dangerous. He saw the world as a canvas, and we were just brushstrokes, replaceable and disposable." Oscar Finch arrived at the precinct later that day. Known for his carefully cultivated public image, Oscar was immaculately dressed, exuding the same polish and charm that had made him a staple in the art world. But Naomi could see the weariness in his eyes, a subtle tension in his posture that betrayed the strain of maintaining his facade. "Thank you for coming, Oscar," Naomi said as he settled into the chair across from her. "I appreciate your willingness to discuss Luca." Oscar crossed his legs, his hands folded neatly over his knee. His gaze was sharp, calculating, the eyes of a man accustomed to weighing every word. "Of course, Detective. I understand you have questions. I'll do my best to answer." Naomi wasted no time, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Simon and Mara both shared difficult truths about Luca, how he viewed those closest to him as impurities in his life, people who didn't meet his impossible standards. They saw the fall of saints as a declaration, a message that he intended to remove them. For the first time, Oscar's carefully constructed mask slipped. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his gaze shifting to the wall behind her before meeting her eyes again. There was a flicker of something raw in his expression, something he was struggling to keep contained. "Luca was a genius, Detective," Oscar began, his voice still measured but carrying a hint of darkness. "But he was also troubled. That obsession with purity? It wasn't just a philosophy, it was a consuming force. He saw the world as an extension of his art, and he saw people as either worthy or unworthy of being part of it." Naomi leaned forward, sensing that Oscar was finally ready to reveal the truths he had kept hidden. "Did he ever discuss this with you directly?" Oscar exhaled slowly, his composure wavering. "Not in so many words. Luca was subtle. He preferred implication, suggestion. He'd look at you a certain way, say things that left you wondering if you'd failed him. Over time, I began to see how he pushed people out of his life, almost as if he were purging them." Naomi's eyes narrowed as she considered his words. Simon and Mara both mentioned that they felt Luca had a pattern, one that involved removing anyone who disappointed him. Ella, Julian, Anton, they all crossed him and they all ended up dead. Did you notice this pattern too? Oscar's expression darkened, his gaze dropping for the first time. "Yes, I noticed. But what could I do? Luca was untouchable. He was the art world's golden boy, and questioning him would have meant the end of my career. He had a way of controlling people, manipulating them into silence. By the time you realized what he was capable of, it was too late." Naomi felt a chill as she listened, each piece fitting into the puzzle she had been assembling. Luca's world was a fortress of control, a carefully constructed reality where only those who met his impossible standards were permitted to remain. And when someone failed him, he found a way to eliminate them. "So when you saw the mural," Naomi continued, her voice gentle but insistent, "when you saw yourself painted alongside Simon and Mara with those expressions, those symbols, you felt like you were next?" Oscar's composed exterior cracked, and for a brief moment his true fear shone through. "Yes," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw that mural and I knew. He had painted us as his fallen saints, his failures, his impurities. It was a warning, Detective, a message that we didn't belong in his world anymore." Naomi let the silence hang, allowing Oscar's words to settle. The man before her wasn't the confident, polished dealer she'd expected. He was someone who had been pushed to the edge, forced to confront a reality that shattered his carefully maintained facade. "You, Simon, and Mara acted to survive," Naomi said softly, her voice free of judgment. "You did what you had to do." Oscar nodded, his face haunted. "We didn't have a choice. Luca was a threat we couldn't escape. We knew he would never stop, that he would go to any length to purify his world, and we weren't willing to let him do that to us." Naomi felt a pang of empathy for the man sitting before her. In Luca's world, survival had become a matter of betrayal or destruction, forcing each of them into an impossible choice. As Naomi pored over her notes later that evening, she felt the weight of each revelation settle over her. Luca Vermeulen had been a man of immense talent, but his genius had come at an unimaginable cost. He had surrounded himself with people he could control, bending their lives to fit his vision, only to discard them when they no longer served his purpose. The Fall of Saints wasn't just a masterpiece. It was Luca's final act of control, a calculated declaration of his worldview, a world where only those who met his impossible standards were permitted to remain. Each interview, each file she reviewed, revealed a new layer of Luca's manipulation. He had been both mentor and tyrant, a figure who commanded loyalty while giving none in return. And those who dared to defy him had found themselves trapped in a nightmare, their lives consumed by his relentless pursuit of artistic purity. As narrated at the photographs of the mural, each face took on a new significance. Simon, Mara, and Oscar had not been paranoid or overly dramatic. They had been victims, trapped in a web of controls so intricate that escape had seemed impossible. Luca had pushed them to the edge, forcing them to choose between submission and destruction. In the quiet of her office, Naomi allowed herself a moment of reflection. She felt a profound sadness for those who had been caught in Luca's shadow, each one drawn in by his brilliance, only to be consumed by the darkness that lay beneath. The Fall of Saints would stand as both Luca's greatest work and his greatest failure, a testament to the devastating power of unchecked genius. Naomi closed her case notes, feeling the heavy weight of the investigation lingering like a shadow. Luca Vermeulen's legacy was not just his art, but the fear he had instilled in those closest to him. His genius had cast a long, dark shadow, transforming his studio into a prison, a place where he wielded power over his loved ones, with an iron grip disguised as mentorship. Stepping out into the night, Naomi knew that this case would stay with her. It was a stark reminder of the fine line between brilliance and madness, of the people who had suffered for the sake of an artist's twisted vision. As she walked away from the precinct, Naomi felt a sense of closure, tempered by the knowledge that for Simon, Mara, and Oscar, there would be no easy escape from the trauma Luca had inflicted. His shadow would haunt them, a reminder of the price they had paid for living in a world created by a man who demanded everything, yet gave nothing in return.
Whispers of Forever, a life without end. In the kingdom of our chorus, a land of towering citadels and lush enchanted forests, there lived a man named Calus. From a young age, Calus had been captivated by the idea of immortality. While his friends dreamed of riches, fame, and love, Calus wanted only one thing: to defy death itself. Death to him was a cruel thief that snatched away everything dear to people: family, friends, happiness. If he could live forever, he thought, he would never lose anything. As a boy, Calus watched his father wither away from a wasting illness. His once strong, larger-than-life father, the man who had taught him to wield a sword, to climb the tallest trees, and to laugh at the world's woes, was reduced to a shadow of his former self. Calus spent many nights by his father's side, staring at the frail figure, terrified of what was to come. Death was not just taking his father, it was taking his hero, his anchor. When his father finally passed, Calus was numb with grief. His mother, already weak from worry, could not bear the weight of the loss. In less than a year, she too succumbed to the cruel hands of grief. Calus was left alone, orphaned before he was even of age to understand the finality of death. But even in his sorrow, he felt something awaken within him, a defiant seed, a fierce determination to not let the same fate claim him. Why must people die? Why must time ravage the ones we love? The thought gnawed at him until it became his singular drive. He vowed that he would conquer death, no matter the cost. Calus was not like the other children in the village. While they played and laughed, dreaming of growing up, getting married and living normal lives, Calus spent his days reading whatever books he could get his hands on, particularly those about ancient legends, forbidden magics, and the elusive mysteries of life. He would often sit at the edge of the forest, staring out at the horizon, imagining what it would be like to live forever, to never age, to never die. The very thought of death became intolerable to him. Years passed, and Calus grew into a man. His childhood friends drifted into adulthood, marrying, having children, and living their lives. But Calus had other plans. He became a scholar, seeking out ancient texts, forbidden knowledge, and rumors of lost magic. He heard stories of sorcerers from ancient times who had sought immortality, of kings who had traded their souls for eternal life, and of a relic, an artifact said to bestow eternal life upon its bearer. The Amulet of Eternus, it was called, rumored to be hidden in the sacred caves of Mount Ajar, a mountain feared and revered for its divine power. The more he learned about the amulet, the more obsessed he became. He ventured into distant lands, sailed across perilous seas, and braved hostile jungles. His journey was long, but his determination was unwavering. Every step he took brought him closer to his goal, and with each step he distanced himself further from the life he once knew. His friends no longer recognized the man he had become, driven, ruthless, singular in his pursuit. After years of searching, Calus finally found Mount Ajar. The path to the amulet was treacherous, guarded by traps and beasts not of this world, but Calus was relentless. He spent years climbing, battling the bitter cold, the howling winds, and the creatures that lurked in its shadowed crags. He faced trials that would have broken, but Calus's will was ironclad. Eventually, he reached the heart of the mountain, where the amulet lay, pulsing with an eerie blue light. The stone chamber was silent, save for the hum of the artifact's magic, and as Calus grasped it in his hands, he felt a surge of power flood his veins. His wish had been granted. The moment he placed the amulet around his neck, he felt it. His body no longer ached from the journey, his muscles no longer tired. The passage of time itself seemed to slow, and as the years passed, Calus did not age. He remained as he was, strong, agile, youthful. He had conquered death. For centuries, Calus lived as an immortal. At first, it was everything he had dreamed of. His body did not age, nor did it weaken. He became a warrior without equal, a scholar whose knowledge grew with every passing year. He watched kings rise and fall, empires flourish and crumble, but through it all, he remained unchanged. While others perished, he endured. He traveled the world, mastering skills, accumulating wealth, and expanding his knowledge. The world to him was an endless playground. While others feared the passing of time, he relished in it. What did it matter that civilizations rose and fell? He would outlive them all. However, as time stretched on, the cracks in his perfect dream began to show. The first blow came with the loss of his children. Calus, having outlived his wife by many decades, had distanced himself from his offspring, watching as they grew old, married, and had children of their own. Yet, as the centuries marched on, one by one, they too succumbed to the inevitable pull of death. He stood at their graves, feeling an emptiness he had not anticipated. His heart ached with a grief that seemed bottomless, for he had loved them dearly. But time had taken them from him, just as it had taken his parents so long ago. He had watched as their bodies weakened, as they aged and withered before his eyes. He tried to offer them solace, but how could they understand his world? He was untouched by time, while they were shackled to its cruel march. His grandchildren grew old, and even his great-grandchildren passed into the grave before him. Next, his friends began to wither away. Over the years, Calus had formed close bonds with many, but one by one, they too fell to the ravages of time. He had seen it before, but each time it happened, the pain did not lessen. Calus attended their funerals, a silent observer, watching as his world grew smaller and smaller. Each time it hurt a little more. Each loss dug deeper into his soul, leaving behind a hollow shell of the man he once was. As centuries turned into millennia, the world itself began to change. The bustling cities Kalis once knew were now ruins. The people, the customs, the language, everything had shifted. The familiar was gone, replaced by a world that felt foreign and cold. He wandered through these strange lands, feeling more isolated than ever. The joy of immortality had faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of loneliness. No longer did he find solace or mastering new arts. The thrill of adventure, the excitement of discovering new lands, all of it had lost its luster. Every city, every village, every person he encountered reminded him of what he had lost. The faces of those he had loved, those who had once shared his dreams, were now nothing more than fading memories. His immortality had robbed him of the very thing he had sought to protect, his connection to life itself. Kalis could not understand why the pain of loss never dulled, even after centuries. Surely with time, one should grow numb to such sorrow. But the opposite was true. The more he lived, the deeper the sorrow grew, as if the universe itself was reminding him that he was never meant to live this long. He wandered aimlessly, a ghost in a world that no longer knew his name. The citadels of our chorus had crumbled to dust, the forests had grown wild and untamed, and the very earth beneath his feet seemed foreign. He was a relic of a forgotten time, an artifact of a world long past. Why did I want this? He often found himself asking, though no answer came. The once powerful and determined man now drifted lost, disconnected from the world around him. There was no one left to share in his victories, no one to mourn his losses. He had become a stranger in a world that no longer needed him. One day, in his endless wandering, Kalis came across an old, decrepit village at the edge of the world. There, he met a woman, an ancient priestess who had lived longer than most, though not as long as Kalis. Her eyes, though cloudy with age, were sharp, as if they could see into the depths of his soul. "You carry the curse of eternal life," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "A curse?" Kalis scoffed bitterly. "I once believed it was a blessing." "Only the young and foolish think that way. Life is meant to be fleeting. Death is not an end, but a doorway." Kalis had heard similar words before, but had always dismissed them. Death, he had believed, was the enemy, the one force to be overcome. He had spent centuries trying to escape it, to avoid its grasp, but now he was beginning to wonder if he had been wrong. "What lies beyond that doorway?" he asked, though he was unsure if he wanted to know. The priestess smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "There is a place beyond this world, a place where time does not pass, where those we have lost wait for us. In death, we find reunion, not separation. We become eternal in a way far different from what you now experience." The words struck Kalis like a thunderbolt. A place where those he had lost might still exist. A place where love and joy might be found once again. "How can I pass through this doorway?" he asked, hope flickering in his chest for the first time in centuries. "That is the cruel irony," the priestess replied. "For as long as you wear the amulet of Eternus, you are bound to this world. Immortality in this life comes at the cost of eternal peace in the next. To pass through the doorway, you must first surrender the gift you so desperately sought." Kalis felt a surge of fear. Was he truly ready to give up the life he had fought so hard to attain? The amulet had salvation, but it had also become his prison. "How?" he asked, desperation lacing his voice. The priestess held out her hand. "Give me the amulet. Only then can you be free." Kalis hesitated, feeling the weight of the amulet against his chest. Could he truly surrender it? After all these years of fighting, after all the sacrifices he had made, could he let go? But then he remembered the faces of his children, his friends, and the countless loved ones he had lost. He remembered the loneliness, the aching void in his heart that nothing could fill. Immortality had robbed him of everything he cherished. With trembling hands, he unclasped the amulet and placed it in the priestess's hands. As soon as the weight lifted from his neck, A great sense of peace washed over him, as if a burden he had carried for centuries had been lifted. "Rest now, Kalis," the priestess whispered. "Your time has come." And as darkness gently closed in around him, Kalis felt no fear. Instead, he felt warmth, a sense of belonging, and the presence of those he had lost. For the first time in centuries, he knew that death was not something to be feared. It was, in fact, a return to the place where love and life continued in ways he could never have imagined. In the end, Kalis had found true immortality, not in life, but in the love and memories of those who waited for him beyond the veil. And so he passed into the next world, not with dread, but with hope, knowing that death was not the end, but the beginning of something far greater.